Hi everybody. Welcome to today's session on assessment in the context of remote teaching. Before we start talking about assessment during remote teaching, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the particular South African context in which we currently find ourselves, and indeed the context within which the globe finds itself. We're moving rather rapidly to remote teaching and learning. Remote teaching and learning in the South African context is a far from ideal solution. It is only indeed a partial solution, and it will be particularly challenging for traditionally face-to-face institutions. We will have to anticipate a range of problems accessing remote learning spaces. We will have to adapt our practices, and we will need to create accommodations for the diversity of students and staff facing this task. However, at this point, remote teaching is the situation that we find ourselves in. UCT students are officially on holiday until the 20th of April, and Term 2 will run remotely. It is very probable that we will not find ourselves back to face-to-face teaching until August. While we hope to be back into face-to-face mode at that time, we are in uncertain times. We will need to adjust and make accommodations and offer special dispensations as the situation around us shifts and changes. Our principle moving into this difficult time is that we must work from a place of uncertainty, but we must plan nonetheless. The ground under our feet may shift at any moment, and so we cannot grow too attached to any single response, but we must have a response to the situation. Additionally, we will need to exercise kindness and compassion with others and ourselves, because any of the choices that we make will have consequences. At the moment, we are in this stage of response where we have almost entire student closure. In fact, South Africa is in lockdown, so we have a full student closure with remote learning. Staff are also working from home at the moment, and access to campus resources, Wi-Fi, the library, etc., is limited to what we can get hold of online. In the South African context, we are further limited by historical inequalities, challenges around internet and data access and devices, and very possibly problems around electricity. Additionally, not all our students find themselves in what could be described as ideal learning environments at the moment. And so we will need to take these into consideration as we attempt to guide them through this remote learning time. A recent DVC desk, dated 19th of March, highlighted the following. Given the challenges that we face and that our students face, UCT has opted for a low-tech option. Where possible, we are in discussions to organize zero-rated data to specific UCT online resources. Additionally, vulnerable students, including students with disabilities, will be supported through a specific working group, and a full plan of support will be made available. And finally, there will be provision for contact catch-up time. So over the last 4 Level 1 webinars, we've looked at what it would take to take content, student activities, and communication and learning online. In this session, which is the 4th session, we're going to be looking at what do we do in terms of assessment, in terms of specifically assessment in the context of remote learning. What I want to emphasize is that this is not the ideal context for either assessment or remote learning. Staff and students are both stressed, anxious, and concerned. Communally, we are trying to make plans without a full understanding of the context, and indeed without the time support and institutional access that we would normally give a project of this magnitude. And we're trying to deal with the particular challenges that our staff are facing. We cannot, in the current context, however, design exclusively for students with the most limited access. Instead, we can and should do everything we can to make additional learning opportunities available for these students. We're hearing very strong inclinations around alternative accommodations, such as the winter or summer school or the shifted academic year, and catch-up camps, that kind of thing. However, we do need to make plans for some kind of online assessment or remote assessment. So this particular image is borrowed from a colleague, and what this image seeks to do is to map the immediacy of an assessment onto access and bandwidth. So in the horizontal line over here, you've got immediacy from things that have very high immediacy, like, for example, a face-to-face clinical exam, to things that have very low immediacy. For example, a video submission or an e-portfolio that a student can work on for over a period of time. In the vertical dimension, we've got digital access and bandwidth. And for now, we're mapping that as both access to devices and access to data. Mapped over all of this, of course, is the kind of general life challenges that people face in the moment. Up here in the top left-hand corner are assessment options that demand both high immediacy and high resourcing, either physical labs and workshops and spaces, or the online equivalent of that, and a kind of sense of an activity that must be completed now. On the other hand, in this kind of diametrically opposed corner, we have activities that require low immediacy and low resourcing. So a take-home task where students could simply have a question or an activity that they take their own time to do, where there isn't a huge demand in terms of resources, would be located in this corner here. You will see, however, that many of the kinds of activities that we conventionally use actually are quite reliant on high resources. So, for example, online pracs and labs, the creation of collaborative projects and documents, things like practical CAD tests or design tests, e-portfolios, video submissions, presentations, particularly recorded ones, all live up here. So when we're thinking about our assessment, we need to kind of be responding to how do we move things as far from these red, yellow, blue spaces as we can, and as close as possible to this low immediacy, low resource demand space. So as a starting point, it is helpful to think about three things in relation to your design. The first one is that you might consider reweighting, redesigning, or digitizing particular assessments. In a reweighting type scenario, you would take something that you'd already marked and you give it a greater weighting. Sometimes it's a little bit tricky because maybe that's an activity that students have thought, well, it wasn't so important, or it was an early activity and they were still learning. However, in the UCT context, because of the timing of the COVID-19 crisis, very few staff actually have any substantial marks for their students. And so reweighting becomes less and less of an option actually for us. So then you might look at the redesign option and you might ask yourself, can I redesign my assessment to meet the particular learning outcomes that I want? So can I get my students to work on a video presentation as opposed to a face-to-face one? Can I get my students to write reflection papers or some kind of written project paper, essay, etc.? If your very strong sense is no, you have to have some kind of cumulative assessment, or some kind of summative assessment, we would ask you, are you absolutely positive? Is high stakes testing really something that you have to do in this context at this point in time? And if that is the case, then we might want to consider digitizing it. And by digitizing it, we mean not only thinking about moving it online, but also thinking of changing the format so that it's something that suits being online. So let's look then at some very broad strategies for assessment under remote learning conditions. So the first thing is to defer or reschedule deadlines where you can. We are hearing about people who still have deadlines for sort of mid-April. And we would strongly encourage folks to reschedule those. Second of all, and this is not an option to us, assess what's been taught before the time of the campus-based restrictions. We're going to ignore that one. Overview or review your general assessment profile. What has been done, what can be waived or changed? When faced with this question, what can be waived or changed, people often say nothing. And they either say nothing because they feel like it is critical to the integrity of their course that the assessment remains the same, or because they have some kind of external professional body to which they answer in terms of their course structure. In relation to both of these, there are opportunities to redesign assessment in such a way that you comment on what students have learned without necessarily doing a final invigilated exam. And so we can indeed start thinking about what can be waived or changed. Additionally, the University of South Africa are in conversation with the various professional bodies to look at how some of the requirements, particularly for non-graduating students, might shift for this academic year. You might change the mode of submission, and you might offer some alternative assessments. Either of or any of these might be a strategy that you might adopt for adjusting your current assessment plan to represent a case. Each of the cases demonstrates an assessment profile for a particular kind of course. On each slide, we're going to show you the changes that an academic might make when faced with the kinds of conditions that we currently are faced with. Each slide will introduce a particular kind of assessment that we might recommend for that particular situation. So in this instance, the assessment profile for the course was very strong on performance activities. You'll see teaching practicals, classwork performances, a portfolio, and a performance exam. What the staff member in question opted to do was that they opted to change both the timing, the weighting, and in some ways the order of some of these particular cases. So they opted to take the essay and leave it exactly as is, but they changed the mode. They made it a submit online. They took the teaching practical, and instead of making it a face-to-face teaching practice the student conducted, they had the student reflect on an authentic local case. In terms of the classwork performances, they converted both of those to videos, which students could submit to Vula. And then in terms of the portfolio, they had them just submit that as an e-portfolio and assignment. A big shift came in their kind of final piece of assessment, which was that they looked at deferring their final exam, their performance exam, and reconstructing it with a mini teaching component. But for them, one of the things that was critical was shifting from a regular face-to-face portfolio, physical portfolio, to an electronic. So let's look at this case. This case has some very strong emphasis on practical laboratory sessions. In this instance, you've got a situation where there are 1, 2, 3 face-to-face labs, a midterm test, a lab exam, and an additional theoretical exam. So this particular academic is opting to do some redesigning of those. So the lab practicals are going to be responses either to online demonstrations or to virtual simulations with data sets, with a stronger emphasis on interpretation than was previously the case. Their midterm test is going to just simply be redesigned as a take-home test. And then their final exam, they're looking at working with randomized multiple choice questions, short answer questions, and rubric marking as a way to be able to shift from the typical face-to-face invigilated exam marking scenario. Our fourth case is a case where there's a strong emphasis on learning to write the language of the discipline. And in this instance, the academic in question had already had an opportunity to do one task, so they've kept that task. They haven't actually reweighted it, but as they've moved through the rest of their program, they've looked at reweighting, redesigning, and then changing modes to try to ensure that they maintain some of their assessment practices. So they've made it a little bit easier for students to work on short essay questions, rather than a kind of face-to-face invigilated essay task. And that's allowed them to shift some of what they'd be willing to do in that scenario. Finally, what we have here is a case which has a very strong design element to it, where students need specific software, normally accessible via labs at UCT. So you'll see in this instance that the course is organized around design activities, a class test, an assignment, a CAD test, a second class test, and then an exam. And that actually students can build their marks, accumulate their marks over the spread of the term. And that what happens is they get to choose either their mark from class test 1 or their mark from class test 2, whichever is higher, to contribute the 20% that goes to their final mark. So in this instance, there are some possibilities. However, we have to also recognize that in this instance, there are substantial constraints. So this particular staff member, in addition to dealing with all the normal constraints that all of us deal with, is also dealing with this problem with proprietary software. So there are a limited number of licenses. They are all attached to specific computers at UCT. So there is the possibility of students being able to either use virtual machines or to VPN in, and ICTS is looking at that at the moment. But those are still challenging things. So what this particular staff member might opt to do in the current context is they might opt to look at design as a conceptual exercise during the remote teaching period, with students rather being encouraged to demonstrate their designs in other way rather than using drawing software to do so. And that this particular element around the drawing software be relocated into some kind of catch-up time, which we've talked about as we've gone through this session. So this case is a particularly challenging one. And if you find yourself in a situation where you have a challenging case, either you have a physical practical, or you have an online practical, such as this one, or you've got something like a demonstration that students have to do. I'm thinking specifically of the clinical and health sciences here. Then those are the kinds of scenarios where you might well decide as a department or a faculty that some element of student learning needs to be removed from this remote teaching period and relocated in an intensive catch-up time. And that is definitely something that can still be discussed and worked with. We're currently working on an assessment document to support staff in making their choices. And what that will do is it'll move you from thinking about your current assessment through some of the alternative assessment options, and then onto what are the particular quality challenges for those choices. We do recognize, however, that this is not going to be the equivalent of a regular, normal academic semester. That said, we don't have the option for a regular, normal academic semester. Finally, just before we close, let's talk a little bit about assessment feedback. So we've been talking about the assessment design process, but feedback is a substantial element of that. And when we're planning for feedback, we need to think about the level of effort for staff to give feedback, to provide feedback, and the level of effort for students to take that feedback on and work with it. The technical demand of providing feedback, both for staff and students. What kind of mode it should be in. Should it be written? Should it be a voice feedback? Should it be video feedback? Whether this feedback needs to be communal or whether it could be individual. While it is ideal to give individual feedback, sometimes that's very demanding in terms of effort and tech demand. So we might offer some kind of communal feedback. And then we would want to think about our rubrics and memos so that those two things minimize the amount of effort, both for us as markers and for students in terms of learning from that experience. And then finally, a brief comment on quality. Conventionally, we think about quality in terms of validity, reliability, transparency, and fairness. In order to achieve any claims about quality in the current moment, we're going to have to let go of the idea that we can do the same thing for everybody, and that fairness is limited to doing the same thing for everybody. For example, somebody who is in a space where they can live a reasonable standard of living even through lockdown requires perhaps slightly different kinds of support than somebody who is in very crowded conditions, or who doesn't have internet access, or in fact doesn't have electricity, or who has to walk for some period of time to buy data. We might have to consider different treatments for different students. And while that is not the same, that may be the fairest we can be under the circumstances. Finally, before we close, we'd just like to remind you that you can find the various resources that we've referred to here, and more, at the remote teaching page at SILT, and that we do encourage you to follow us on Twitter, where we will be sharing more resources. The first place, though, if you're going to follow us or if you're going to check in, is the SILT remote teaching page. Colleagues, we wish you well in these very, very difficult times, and hope that you are finding the strength to respond creatively, not only to the challenges that you are facing as an educator, but to the challenges that we all face as human beings in this particular moment. Take care, be well. Bye for now.